At my son's wedding, the bride's father humiliated me in front of 500 guests. He pointed at my janitor's uniform and mocked, "That is not a father, that is a liability." Though my future daughter-in-law laughed with contempt. Just as my son stood up to call off the wedding to defend me, I held his hand and said one sentence that made them all go pale, and that was the moment they realized they had mocked the wrong man. Before we begin, leave a comment and let me know, where in the world are you watching from? Your presence makes this story complete. Please note certain elements and names have been adjusted for creative and educational purposes. I hope the message behind these events resonates with you today. My name is Walter Greer. I am 67 years old, and I have spent the better part of 4 decades mopping floors that I own, not because I had to, but because I wanted to see exactly who a man becomes when he thinks no one important is watching. Tonight I am sitting at table 47 in a custodian's work jacket that costs less than the flowers on the nearest table, and I am watching 500 people celebrate a wedding I did not know how to stop. The Grand Atrium Ballroom on the Magnificent Mile is the kind of room that makes you feel the weight of what you are not. Crystal chandeliers hang 40 feet above the floor, throwing light across 500 faces, arranged in careful social hierarchies. The closer to the stage, the more you matter, apparently. Table 47 sits beside the kitchen service doors, close enough that I can smell the white truffle reduction and the stress sweat of catering staff who have been on their feet since 4 in the afternoon. My son, Caden Greer, 29 years old, stands at the altar in a tuxedo that cost more than 3 months of my publicly known salary. He is tall, lean, and very still, the stillness that precedes a decision. He has been deciding something since the ceremony began. I have not interrupted that process. Aubrey Voss is at the far end of the room in $45,000 of ivory silk the wedding program calls architectural. I call it a performance because I have learned over the 14 months of this engagement that everything Aubrey does is a performance, warmth, laughter, tenderness, all of it executed with the precision of someone who has studied the effect she intends to create. Her mother, Lenora Voss, sits at the head table in enough diamond jewelry to fund a year of college tuition, smiling with a mouth that has spent 30 years practicing the expression. The smile no longer reaches her eyes. I am not sure it ever did. The table had no centerpiece, no Chiavari chairs, just standard ballroom issue with slightly creased linen, no name card. The wedding coordinator, unable to meet my eyes, explained the seating had been arranged by the bride's family. I thanked her. She seemed surprised. Dorian Voss, 57, built like a man who has spent his life believing his physical size entitles him to take up space in every room, rises from the head table at 7:42 p.m. He is wearing a charcoal London suit that I know was paid for with borrowed money because I'd tracked the lender myself. He picks up a microphone, and the ballroom's ambient string quartet reduces to silence with the efficiency of professionals who understand that the man with the microphone has decided this is his moment. Dorian is good at deciding things are his moment. He begins walking, not toward the stage, not toward the bar, toward table 47. 500 feet of polished floor, and he walks every inch of it with the deliberate pace of a man who wants the room to watch him arrive. Have you ever watched a man cross a room to humiliate you and recognized in that same moment that the most powerful thing you could do was absolutely nothing? My palms pressed the linen. I kept my face still. I let him come. He raised his glass. Some men build empires, he announced. Some men, and here he paused. The practiced pause of a man who has rehearsed this, are the reason their sons spend their lives apologizing for where they came from. He pointed at me. To the Greer family, may Caden finally have the chance to become the man his father never could. 500 people were very quiet. I did not move. I did not blink. I was already counting the cost of every word he was spending. Aubrey laughed. Not a polite laugh, not a nervous laugh. A real one. The laugh of a woman who has never once had to consider what it costs to find something funny at someone else's expense. Her diamond ring caught the chandelier light and threw a small star across the ceiling above table 47. Dorian raised his glass higher. The 500 people, recognizing their cue they were supposed to participate in, began to applaud. I let them finish. The bitter residue of the parking garage coffee was still on my tongue. Champagne filled every glass in the room except mine. Caden at the altar had gone very still, in a way that was different from his earlier stillness, the kind of stillness that precedes a decision that cannot be undone. My fingertips rested against the card in my breast pocket the one no building custodian in the history of this city has ever carried. The stiff collar of the work jacket pressed against my neck. I did not adjust it. 500 people were applauding a man. 9 minutes. That was how long my son sat with his hands flat on the table and his jaw set, and his whole body the particular stillness of a man who is making a decision he will not unmake. I had already made mine. I sat at table 47 and watched him arrive at his, and I did not rush him. Some decisions need their full 9 minutes. The applause had settled into the hum of a room trying to return to normal after something abnormal has occurred. Waitstaff moved between tables with the practiced invisibility of professionals doing their jobs inside someone else's crisis. Dorian had returned to the head table, accepting congratulations with the ease of a man who has confused cruelty for wit so many times that the distinction no longer registers. Lenora had rearranged her smile. Aubrey had turned away from the room and was speaking to someone near the floral arrangement. At the stage turned away, I noted from Caden. Then my son's chair scraped the ballroom floor. One sound, deliberate. Not the accidental scrape of someone shifting weight, but the full intentional drag of a chair pushed back by a man who has decided to stand up. Every head in the room turned. 500 people trained by the evening's choreography to look wherever the next significant thing was happening all turned at once. I did not turn. I knew his destination. There is a kind of silence that happens in a large room when something real occurs, not the polite silence of ceremony, but the collective recognition of 500 people witnessing something that cannot be undone. That silence arrived as Caden walked from the head table to the center microphone. He did not hurry. He did not look at Dorian. He did not look at Aubrey. He walked the way I have watched him walk into every difficult room since he was 12 years old, like the room belonged to him, and he had simply arrived late. He adjusted the microphone downward. The brief feedback tone cut through the quiet. He cleared his throat once, which was the only sign of anything that was not absolute composure, and then he spoke. His father had worked double shifts for 18 years so he could go to architecture school. His father had worn the same boots for 6 winters so he could have new ones. He said he was standing here in a tuxedo that cost more than 3 months of his father's publicly known salary, and he wanted the room to understand exactly where that tuxedo came from before he said what he was about to say. When a 29-year-old tells the truth in a room that has spent 3 years rewarding comfortable lies, the silence is absolute. It sounds like the absence of everything that was filling the room before. The music had stopped earlier. Now the conversation stopped. The champagne glasses stopped being lifted. Even the kitchen noise behind the service door seemed to reduce itself, as if the building understood that something was happening that required full attention. Caden said any man who calls that a burden is not someone worth marrying into. He did not shout. He did not cry. He simply told the truth in a room full of people who had built their entire lives on the assumption that truth could be purchased into silence. From table 47, I watched Dorian's champagne glass froze mid-lift. I watched Aubrey turn back around from the floral arrangement, her expression moving through several things too quickly to catalog before settling on something harder than any of them. Lenora's smile did not change. That told me more about Lenora than anything she had done all evening. Then my son worked the platinum ring off his finger, not struggling, not angry, deliberately, methodically, not something you wish were different. He held it for a moment, and I watched chandelier light catch the band. He set the ring down. He did not throw it. He set it down on the nearest table, the way a man sets down a tool he no longer needs, with a small clink that carried across the ballroom floor to every ear in the building. There is no wedding. The collective inhale of 500 people is not a metaphor. It is a physical event. I felt it from table 47 as a change in the room's pressure, a drawing in, a suspension. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The candles on the head table continued burning. The chandelier continued throwing light. The room itself continued the way rooms do, indifferent to the human events occurring inside it. Caden walked back to table 47 and sat down beside me. He said nothing. I said nothing. Under the table unseen, I covered his fingers with mine. His skin was cold the way fingers get cold when a body has been running on adrenaline and has just used the last of it. I kept my hand there for a moment. Then I moved it back to the table surface where it had been all evening. I had already made my first call. That we walked out of the Grand Atrium Ballroom without looking back. My son and I and the valet brought my truck around between a black Mercedes and a Range Rover, and not one person who watched us get in understood what they were actually seeing. The truck was a 2009 Ford F-150 faded blue rust, collecting on both wheel wells in the particular way rust collects on a vehicle that is driven rather than maintained. It rattled at idle. The valet had the expression of a young man who was professionally required not to have opinions about the vehicles he parked, and I appreciated his professionalism. I tipped him $20. Caden said nothing. We got in. The parking garage beneath the Grand Atrium has the acoustics of a concrete cathedral, every sound arriving from 2 directions, the original and its echo. I let the engine idle for a moment. Then I reached under the seat. The phone was matte black, encrypted, and satellite-enabled. I want you to think about what it means that a building custodian keeps something like that under the seat of a rusted truck. Think about it for as long as you need. I found it by memory in the dark without looking down, the way you find something you have reached for 10,000 times before. I dialed. It answered on the second ring. Philip Ashford, 46 years old, is the kind of attorney whose voice arrives with the quality of a closing argument. Even at this hour, words delivered with the unhurried precision of a man who has never once been surprised by a phone call. I have known Philip for 19 years. In 19 years, I have never heard him sound unprepared. When I spoke, my voice changed. I cannot explain this to you in a way that does it justice, but the tired, mild-mannered building custodian who had sat at table 47 all evening and absorbed a public humiliation without visible reaction was simply not the person who picked up that phone. The voice that came out of me was flat, precise, and entirely accustomed to moving large amounts of money with a minimum of words. I said execute Protocol 0, acquire the Voss debt portfolio, freeze Dorian's credit lines. I want his cards declined before he orders another bottle of champagne. Philip said, understood. Timeline, I said now, and I hung up. The garage was quiet again, except for the truck's idle. Caden was looking at me, attempting to reclassify me in real time. I put the phone back under the seat and pulled out of the structure onto Michigan Avenue. My son was crying in the passenger seat of my truck, and I let him because some grief needs to be witnessed and not solved, and because I knew, and he did not yet, that the worst of it was still coming. Not because I had failed to protect him, because I had spent 14 months making sure the worst of it would belong entirely to the Voss family, and the transfer was now in motion. His grief tonight was the honest kind, the grief of a man who has just done a right and costly thing. I had no interest in shortening it. I drove south on Lakeshore Drive. The lake was dark to our left, the city lit to our right. And I said nothing for 20 minutes and let the silence do what silence does when two people in a vehicle have experienced the same evening from entirely different positions of knowledge. Then I started talking. Not about the phone, not about Protocol 0, which was not a name I was going to introduce tonight. I talked about the basketball championship, the one Caden won when he was 10 years old, the game I attended instead of closing a $50 million deal. I had been on the phone in the parking lot of his school, deciding which one mattered more. He never knew. I told him now, let me tell you something about the stories a father keeps. Not the ones he tells his children, the ones he keeps for himself in the dark, for the nights when the gap between who he appears to be and who he actually is feels too wide to hold alone. I had a lot of those stories. I had been keeping them for 44 years. The basketball game was the easiest one to start with. I told him what I told him when he was 15 at the kitchen table in Bronzeville, when he asked me why I mopped floors for a living. I said, a man who has money spends it to show people who he is. A man who has character does not need to show anyone anything. He had nodded then, the way a 15-year-old nods when an adult says something that sounds important, but has not yet arrived as true in his own experience. I wondered driving south whether it had arrived yet. At some point quietly, with the specific exhaustion of a man who has run out of the energy required to hold a question inside, he said, "Who is Philip Ashford? That's all they need to know. We'll talk tomorrow." He accepted that. He looked out the passenger window at the lake, at the skyline, at the city moving past us in its ordinary nighttime motion. To the north, they did not knock. I want you to understand that they did not knock, because knocking is something you do at the door of a person whose time you respect. And they had made their position on that question perfectly clear the night before. At 7:08 on a Tuesday morning, my front door simply opened, the way doors open when the people on the other side of them have never once been told that the world does not belong to them. Dorian Voss came in first. He was still in the tuxedo from the night before, which was now wrinkled in the way, expensive fabric wrinkles. After a long night, the jacket creased across both shoulders, the shirt untucked on one side. He smelled of scotch that had cost more per glass than my kitchen table had cost entire. Behind him came Lenora, still in diamonds and cashmere at 7 in the morning, which revealed the kind of woman who plans an 7 a.m. intimidation visit and takes 20 minutes to put on her jewelry first. Aubrey came last, her ivory dress gray at the hem from wherever the night had taken her, and she positioned herself near the door without speaking. The way a person positions themselves near a door when they are there to observe, not participate. She made a complete circuit of the living room, with her eyes the worn rug, the old television, the bookshelf with the missing shelf bracket I had been meaning to fix for 2 years, and each object received a fraction of a second of her attention, just long enough to register its inadequacy and move on. It was the most efficient contempt I had ever witnessed. I had to give her that. Caden was on the couch in last night's tuxedo shirt, his jacket on the floor beside him, awake but not standing. I had heard him in the kitchen at 2 in the morning and again at 5. He had not slept. He was watching the Voss family move through our living room with the stillness of a man who is deciding whether to become the story's next event. I needed him not to be. Not yet. Dorian demanded coffee. I made it. I poured 1 cup and handed it to Lenora because she was nearest, and she took it with 2 fingers at the handle, barely touching the handle. She examined the mug, then me. Then she tipped it against my chest deliberately with the precision of a woman who had spent 54 years learning how to hurt people in ways that look like accidents. The coffee was still hot enough to matter. I felt it go through the flannel, immediately the heat spreading across my sternum, the skin registering a burn that would leave a mark. Oops. 2 syllables, flat as concrete. The voice of a woman who has said the word in that tone many times before and has never once experienced a consequence for it. I reached into my pocket and produced the rag I keep there for exactly the kind of work I actually do, and I pressed it against my chest, and I looked at Dorian Voss. State your business. I did not look at Lenora. Looking at Lenora would have meant she had done something worth looking at her for. I looked at Dorian because Dorian was the one with something to say, and because looking past Lenora as though she were furniture was the only response that cost her anything. And costing her something was the only currency I was willing to spend in that kitchen this morning. The most dangerous thing in that kitchen wasn't the coffee. It was the man who hadn't moved. Every second I stay calm is a second they believe they have already won. I have known this since I was 23 years old, and I learned it from a man who cleaned office buildings for 32 years and never once let anyone see him flinch. Let them believe it. 44 years of believing that a still man is a defeated man, and 44 years of being wrong about it in ways they would only understand when the invoice arrived, not the one Dorian was carrying, but the one I was already preparing. The burn across my chest was not a wound. It was a receipt. Lenora had just handed me something I could use in every room I intended to take from her, and she had done it because she believed I was the kind of man who would simply absorb it and say nothing. She was right about the invoice was 3 pages long, itemized to the decimal point, and included a line at the bottom labeled emotional damages set at $75,000, as though grief were a catering surcharge. I read every line. Venue rental $42,000, catering $68,000, florist $11,400, band $9,000, videographer $6,200, security $4,000. And then below the subtotal, in the same clean corporate font as everything else, emotional damages $75,000. I turned to page 3. The total was $300,000 due in 14 days, with the name of a law firm in the footer I recognized because I owned the building they practice in. I set the invoice down on the table. My eyes found Dorian's face across the kitchen. $300,000 in 14 days, or he would file suit blacklist Caden from every architecture firm in the state of Illinois, and make sure that whatever years I had left were spent explaining to every landlord in the city why my son's application kept coming back, rejected. The words arrived in a single continuous stream, the kind of threat a man delivers when he has rehearsed it alone and believes the rehearsal has made it inevitable. Let me tell you what $300,000 looks like when it is itemized across 3 pages by a man who does not have it. It looks exactly like desperation wearing a custom suit and calling itself confidence. I recognized the law firm's name in the footer, not because they were formidable, but because their rent was 11 days past due and I had not yet decided whether to file the notice. I noted this. I offered no comment. Dorian was still talking. The $60,000 the ring, the dinners, the deposits on the apartment Caden and Aubrey had planned to move into. Caden was already underwater, he explained, and I should not make it worse. His voice carried the practiced reasonableness of a man who believes he is explaining basic arithmetic to someone who struggles with numbers. I kept my face level. A man who tracks your son's credit card statements for 2 years has already shown you what he thinks the marriage is for. The revelation isn't the tracking, it's that he believed he could say it out loud and face no consequences. The engagement was never a romance. It was a financial acquisition. Caden's income, Caden's professional standing, Caden's debt load carefully managed to keep him dependent and compliant. I had suspected this since the 14th month. Hearing Dorian articulate it aloud in my kitchen between the fruit bowl and the coffee I was still wearing on my chest did not surprise me. What it did was move something from the column of suspicion into the column of confirmed fact. I maintain a very orderly set of columns. I will need to think about it. Dorian laughed. Standing in my kitchen in the tuxedo he had slept in, having burned my chest with my own coffee 20 minutes earlier, he laughed. His head tilted back, and the laugh was too large for the room, designed for a bigger audience, the laugh of a man who believed he had just closed the most important meeting of his morning. Take your time, old man. 14 days. Give Caden his regards. The words arrived with the casual authority of someone who has never been told no by a person he has already decided does not matter. Caden, through the kitchen doorway, was still on the couch. I could see his hands on his knees from where I stood. His face was reading the invoice number off mine, which meant he was reading nothing because I was giving him nothing to read. This was its own kind of cruelty, I understood. Asking my son to sit still in the middle of a scene designed to humiliate his father, to trust that stillness was the correct response. I was asking him to trust me with information he did not yet have. He was doing it. I noted that also. Dorian tucked the second copy of the invoice back into the envelope with the satisfaction of a man who has completed a task. Lenora, time to go. She moved to the door with the unhurried ease of a woman who believes she has just watched a lesser person be properly reduced. Aubrey followed without having spoken a word, the entire visit which I found more interesting than anything Dorian had delivered. A woman who does not speak when her father is delivering threats is either in complete agreement or in complete disagreement, and nothing in Aubrey's history suggested disagreement. I watched them walk to their car from the kitchen window. Dorian's stride to the vehicle carried the body language of a man who has just concluded a successful business meeting. He did not glance back at the house. He had no reason to. He believed he had left a frightened old janitor standing in a flannel shirt with a burn on his chest and a $300,000 problem he could not solve. He was right about the flannel shirt. The car pulled out of Calumet Avenue and turned north and disappeared. I stood at the window for a moment after it was gone, not out of sentiment, but because I wanted to be certain it had actually left and was not circling the block. Then I turned back to the kitchen. I braced against the table and moved it aside. The linoleum rug beneath it was worn at the center where 44 years of... There is a specific moment I have thought about it many times since, when my son stood at the top of those stairs and looked down into the room where I had kept my real life for 44 years, and I watched him make the choice to follow me into it. I was already on the first step. I did not look back. I said, "Come on." That was all I said. Some invitations do not require elaboration. He followed. The staircase descended 14 steps from kitchen floor to poured concrete, and the transition was total worn linoleum, giving way to a floor I had poured myself in 1987. The warm domestic smell of the house above, replaced immediately by filtered air, and the particular metallic warmth of active electronics running at capacity. Caden's hand trailed the wall as he came down, and I heard it move from the rough plaster of the house's original construction to the smooth concrete of something that had been installed with entirely different intentions. At the bottom, he stopped. He said, "Dad, what is this?" "It's where I actually work." The room beneath my kitchen was everything the house above it was, not which was, I suppose, the point. A man's secrets do not resemble him. They are what he actually is stripped of everything he chose to show the world. I had chosen to show the world a janitor. What I had kept down here was the reason. I clapped twice. The lights came up and 12 monitors came alive, in a room that Dorian Voss had stood 12 feet above, 30 minutes earlier, believing he was the most powerful person in the building. The screens showed live data feeds, property portfolios, legal status dashboards, the LB Holdings asset map, with 372 color-coded points across metropolitan Chicago. The server racks in the climate-controlled alcove to the right produce their low, continuous frequency, the sound of serious money moving through serious infrastructure at the speed of light. The mahogany desk cost more than the truck in the driveway by a considerable margin, and I had never once mentioned this to anyone. On the far wall, centered and framed in black, was the Forbes cover from 2019, The Ghost of Chicago, Real Estate, How LB Holdings Built a $1, $2 billion portfolio without anyone knowing its founder's name. The photograph on the cover was an aerial view of Chicago, no face because there was no face to print. That had been the condition of the interview. Caden stood in the middle of the room and turned around, slowly taking the full inventory. I sat in the leather chair, the one that had the specific give of a chair that has been used for decades by the same body, and I let him look. He was going to need a few minutes, and I had learned long ago that the most useful thing a person can do while someone else is processing the impossible is absolutely nothing. Then I told him. I told him in sequence because sequence is the only way to make something this large comprehensible. 372 properties. The apartment building we were sitting beneath, he rents his studio from an LB Holdings subsidiary, though he has never known the parent company's name. The storage facility where Dorian Voss keeps the inventory for his development company. The fleet financing arrangement for the car that drove away from this house 30 minutes ago. I watched his face move through the implications of each one, and I did not rush him through any of them. Then I said, as of 3 minutes ago, I also own every dollar you owe to anyone in the world. The ring, the deposits, the credit accounts, all of it acquired and forgiven as of 8:47 this morning. Check your phone. My son looked at his phone. He looked at it for a long time. The number was zero, not reduced, not deferred, not restructured, but zero. The way a debt disappears when the person who holds it decides it no longer exists. He gripped the phone. He did not say anything for a while. I said, Dorian Voss has money. What I have is leverage. There is a difference and he is about to learn it. Caden looked at the Forbes cover. He looked at it the way you look at something that reorganizes every memory you have of a person backwards, forwards, and all the spaces in between. He said, how long? I said 44 years of building 6 years since that cover ran. He said, you mopped floors. I said, I mopped floors I own. The distinction matters. He nodded. Not the nod of a man who has understood the nod of a man who has accepted that understanding will take considerably longer than this morning, and that the morning requires him to function anyway. I'm sorry you didn't know. I am not sorry for why I kept it. He looked at me. He did not ask why yet. I think he knew the why was not a small answer, and that the morning had already asked enough of both of us. I respected that. I have always respected the restraint it takes to not ask a question before you are ready for the answer. Then I said, I have more to show you. But first, the warnings you did not take. I turned to the center monitor. What do you do with footage of your own son telling you that you are wrong? Not cruelly, not maliciously, but with the complete confidence of a man who has been carefully taught over 3 years. To doubt the one person who had never once given him a reason to? I had asked myself that question on March 14th, and again on May 22nd, and again on July 31st. I had asked it sitting in this same chair in this same room, watching this same face on this same monitor. I had not found a satisfying answer to it yet, but I had found a use for the footage, and that would have to be enough. I pressed play on the first file. The restaurant on North Michigan Avenue had white tablecloths and the kind of ambient noise that costs money to be surrounded by other people's comfortable conversations. Silverware on good china. The soft performance of a room where nothing difficult is supposed to happen. On screen, Caden sat across from me in a pressed shirt. His posture, the particular uprightness of a man who has recently been shown what his future is supposed to look like and has adjusted his spine accordingly. The version of me on screen slid a manila folder across the table. Caden opened it. He read the first page. He closed it. Before you watch these recordings, understand this about my son: he is not a foolish man. Everything you are about to see him say was true from where he was standing, which is exactly how the Voss family built the floor he was standing on. They had not made him gullible. They had made him certain. There is a considerable difference, and the second one is much harder to undo. On screen, Caden's response arrived measured and careful. The report read, like I had hired someone to find problems that were not there. The Voss family had been in Chicago real estate for 20 years. The word paranoia arrived with the gentle patience of a man explaining something obvious to someone he loves but does not fully trust to understand. I watched myself on screen nod without reply. I had learned by March that nothing I offered in those restaurants was going to land. I was gathering testimony, not having conversations. I advanced to the second file. May 22nd, Caden's Lincoln Park apartment. The floor-to-ceiling windows behind him showed the city in late afternoon light, which made him look like a man in a magazine spread about a certain kind of aspirational life. I had hired a private investigator by this point, not for the report I presented in March, which was my own research, but for the deeper work that the March report had only suggested. The PI had found the first thread of the Pennsylvania marriage record by April. I had the documentation. I put it on Caden's coffee table. Have you ever watched someone you love use your own values against you? Take the thing you taught them about, not judging people by what they have, and turn it into the reason they refuse to examine the evidence you put in front of them. Caden told me that running a background investigation on the woman he was going to marry was classist. He accused me of doing exactly what the Voss family had done to us, judging people by their assets instead of their character. He delivered it with conviction. He delivered it in my voice, using my framework, arriving at my opposite conclusion. I had taught him those words. I had no response that did not sound like a man retreating from his own principles. I advanced to the third file, July 31st, my kitchen. The same table, the same chairs Dorian Voss had stood beside 48 hours ago in his wrinkled tuxedo. On screen, I set the PI's complete report in front of Caden, not a summary, the full document, because by July, I was out of diplomatic options. Caden studied it for 4 minutes. I had timed it. Then he lifted his gaze and offered his conclusion. I think you have never understood what it means to move in these circles. The Voss family was different. He delivered it not unkindly, the way you address something to a person you have concluded is operating from a limited perspective and for whom you feel a complicated tenderness. Then he stood up and walked out of frame. The third recording ended. The screen went dark. Beside me, my son offered nothing, because there is nothing to say when you have just watched yourself in your own voice tell your father he does not understand the world. I offered nothing either. I let the silence occupy the room for a while. I had waited 3 months between March and July, and 2 months between July and September. I could afford 30 seconds of silence in a basement. On screen, the July version of me sat alone at the kitchen table after Caden left. The recording captured what followed. I closed the PI report. I watched myself close my laptop. I watched myself speak to a room that had no one in it. You chose them. Now, let's see if they choose you. Then I heard it again, my own voice from 4 months earlier, and I turned off the monitor. Present-day cadence. Philip Ashford called at 10:23 a.m. on a Thursday and said 2 words before I could speak. Turn on Instagram. In my 44 years of operating from this basement, those are among the most efficient 2 words anyone has ever used to tell me that the next phase had begun. I pulled the live stream up on the center monitor. The viewer count was already at 52,000 and climbing. Aubrey Voss was in her parents' Gold Coast apartment in a white shirt in front of a single light source positioned to give her face the quality of something luminous and undefended. I want you to watch how this works, not what she says, but the architecture of how she says it. The white shirt, the single light source, the tears that arrive exactly when the camera angle shifts. This is not grief. This is production. I recognize the staging immediately because I know what it looks like when someone has spent time thinking about how they want a camera to find them. Aubrey had thought about it carefully. I gave her that. She said she had been silent because silence felt safe. She said she needed people to understand what Caden's father had done to this family over the years. The intimidation, the control, the long campaign of making her fiancé feel ashamed of where he came from and who he had chosen. She said all of this in the measured cadence of a woman delivering testimony rather than emotion, which told me everything I needed to know about how long she had been writing the script. The viewer count crossed 60,000. I did not move from my chair. I did not reach for my phone. I did not pull up a response form or a press contact or any of the other instruments I could have deployed in the first 5 minutes of that broadcast. When your enemy is overplaying her hand, you do not interrupt her. You document everything she says because she is building your case for you. On a secondary monitor, I could see Philip Ashford's defamation documentation memo already populating timestamps, screenshots, viewer counts, direct transcription of each claim as she made it. Philip works efficiently. It is why I have retained him for 19 years. 17 minutes into the stream, a door opened in the background of Aubrey's frame. And then my son walked into the frame. He had no idea she was live. He had no idea that everything he said in the next 45 seconds would be screenshot captioned and shared 11,000 times before noon. He was still in yesterday's closed phone to his ear, phone pressed to his ear. I just need some space from a really toxic situation right now. I'm stepping away. He did not see the ring light. He did not see the camera. He walked through the background of the frame the way you walk through any room in a building you believe is private, and then he was gone. And Aubrey, who had not broken her expression once, let the camera hold on the doorway he had just walked through, and she nodded once slowly, as if his words had confirmed something she was too gracious to say herself. The viewer count passed 68,000. Caden came downstairs 40 minutes later. He sat across the desk from me, and his phone rang, and he answered it. And I watched his face move through the call, the way a face moves when it is receiving information it did not expect and cannot immediately process. The managing partner's voice on Caden's phone was the voice of a man who plays golf with Dorian Voss on Sunday mornings and had just been given a reason to make that relationship professionally useful. The call lasted 4 minutes. When it ended, Caden set the phone face down on the mahogany desk. What do you do when someone uses your son's own words? He meant honestly. Words he said without knowing anyone was recording. As the mortar for a wall they are building around him. You save the timestamp. You file the documentation. You wait. I had been waiting since last Tuesday, which was the day the PI delivered the first version of the report. I had been building a different kind of case in the same amount of time Aubrey had been building hers. The difference was that mine was true. Caden looked at me. I was already saving Philip Ashford's memo to the archive folder. I did not look up immediately. I let the click of the save confirm itself. Then I said quietly, "Good." She showed us exactly what she is. Caden was quiet for a moment. Then he said she planned this before the wedding. And I said she planned more than this. I looked at him across the desk. 2 days ago in this room, I had told him about the bigamy, the single word I had offered, and then let sit in the air between us without explaining. Today, Thursday, the full report had arrived in Philip's secure inbox at 7:41 a.m., and I had read every page of it before Ashford called at 10:23. I said 10 days ago, I told you I knew about the bigamy since last Tuesday. Today is Thursday. I have had the PI's full report since this morning. Caden said nothing. He looked at the monitor where the archived live stream was still visible, paused on the frame where his own back could be seen, walking through Aubrey's carefully composed shot. He looked at it the way you look. The file had 3 sections. I remember that because I counted them the way you count exits in a building you have never been in before, not out of panic, but out of habit. The first section was the marriage certificate, Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, August 12, 2016. Groom, Marcus Anthony Webb, bride, Simone Elaine Garrett. I set my coffee down. I did not spill it. I set it down carefully as if it were fragile for a long time, and only just realized it was in his hand. The second section was school records, 2 of them. Lily Marie Webb, age 8, enrolled at Kenwood Academy, Chicago, Illinois. Theo James Webb, age 5, Bright Horizons, Early Learning Center, Bronzeville. I had seen Caden's first day of school photograph exactly once in 30 years. He was wearing a blue jacket I had ironed 3 times that morning because I did not know how to say I was proud of him any other way. I looked at Theo Webb's photograph and recognized the jacket. It was the same shade. Children have a way of wearing the same expression across decades. They do not know they are doing it. The third section was the PI's summary note, 7 lines. It read, subject has maintained a primary residence at 4712 South Drexel Avenue, Chicago, Illinois, for approximately 3 years. Subject travels to 87 Sheridan Road, Kenilworth, Illinois, on average 2 to 3 times per week. Subject's legal name does not appear on the Kenilworth property deed. The deed reads LB Holdings, LLC. I read that last line twice. I had not placed it there intentionally as a message. I had placed it there because that is what I do with every asset I want, protected from a lawsuit, a creditor, or a wedding photographer with a subpoena. Coincidences are only coincidences until they are not. Let me tell you what I did next, because this is the part most people get wrong when they imagine what a man does after reading a file like that. I did not call Caden. I did not call Philip. I opened my desk drawer, removed a plain white envelope, counted $10,000 in $100 bills, and sealed it. Then I wrote 4 words on the front. Not a name, not a return address. 4 words. For the children's education. I drove to 4712 South Drexel Avenue myself. I did not park in front of the building. I parked 1 block north and walked. I slid the envelope under the door of Unit 2B at 6:47 in the evening. I do not know if Marcus Webb was home. I did not knock. I drove back to Calumet Avenue, reheated my coffee, and sat down at the kitchen table. I have been asked in the years since why I sent the money before I knew what I was going to do about any of it. The honest answer is that the children had not done anything wrong. The second honest answer is that I have been the child in that kind of photograph. I know what it looks like when someone's father makes a decision that takes the jacket off your back. I was not willing to be that mechanism even at 1 remove. Here is the thing about information. It does not demand action. It only demands honesty. You can sit with a file for as long as you need, provided you are honest with yourself about what you are sitting with. I was sitting with evidence that my son's new wife had a legal husband and 2 children in the same city. I was sitting with the knowledge that the property those children's father visited twice a week was registered to my company. I was sitting with a $10,000 envelope I had just delivered in the dark. None of that required me to move faster than I was ready to move. On the morning of September 4th, 2024, Philip Ashford called and said the words I had been waiting for. He said the Alinea reservation is confirmed. I said what time. He said 8 o'clock. I said who made it. He said Dorian Voss made it under his own name for a party of 4. Aubrey Caden Dorian and 1 guest listed as T. Garrett. I wrote the name down on my legal pad. T. Garrett. The same last name as Simone Elaine Garrett on the Pennsylvania marriage certificate. I underlined it once. I did not go to Alinea that night. I did not need to be inside the room. I needed the room to exist. I needed Caden to be in it, with those 3 people ordering food he could not afford, on a card attached to an account I had been watching for 11 months. In a restaurant with a fixed tasting menu that required a prepaid reservation, which meant there was a digital record of every name associated with that table before the first course arrived. Documentation is not revenge. Documentation is geometry. You are simply recording where every line ends. Philip sent me the photograph at 9:52 p.m., 1 image. Caden Dorian Aubrey, and a man I did not recognize but whose jaw carried the same angle as Theo Webb's school photograph. The man was laughing. Caden was looking at his phone. I saved the photograph to the same encrypted folder as the PI report, the bigamy certificate, and the school records. Then I closed the laptop. The folder had a name. I had named it on through the transmitter in my son's lapel. I heard Dorian Voss describe my son's decision to cancel his own wedding as a documented stress-related mental health episode, and I will tell you honestly that the hardest thing I did that entire evening was not signal Glenn until I had heard every word of it. I was sitting at the service station table 15 feet from the Voss alcove in a chauffeur's jacket I had borrowed from a man named Raymond, who was 5 inches shorter than me and did not mind. The jacket pulled across my shoulders. The tap water in front of me was untouched. I had been at that table for 40 minutes listening through a single earpiece when Dorian slid the press release across the white tablecloth toward Caden. I could not see the document. I did not need to. I had read the draft 3 days earlier because Philip Ashford had subpoenaed the Voss family's communications attorney the week before, and the attorney, faced with a discovery request of unusual precision, had made a decision that attorneys make when they realize the person filing the request already knows the answer. Dorian's voice in my ear was smooth and reasonable. He said, "Sign the release, say you were under pressure, that the mental health challenges were real, that the cancellation was mutual." He said this goes away. He said your career goes back to normal. He said, "Be a good son and let the adults handle this." I counted the seconds between each sentence. I have done that for 44 years, counted the seconds in other people's silences, because the space between what a man says and what he says next is where the truth lives. I want you to understand what it took to sit at that table with tap water and a chauffeur's cap, and listen to a man describe my son's moral courage as a mental health episode, and do nothing except wait for the right moment to nod at Glenn. Glenn is the Alinea floor manager, a man who has worked the restaurant for 11 years without knowing that the building's land deed carries my name. And when I nodded at him from the service station table, he moved with the efficiency of a man who has been waiting for a reason to be useful. Within 4 minutes, a sommelier was moving through the dining room with bottles of vintage Burgundy, table by table, methodical quiet. The way good service always looks inevitable rather than arranged. The Voss alcove received nothing. What the Voss alcove received was their bill $22,400 on a silver tray, and beneath the bill, a linen napkin on which I had written 4 words before I sat down. "Enjoy your last supper." I did not watch Dorian's face when he read it. I was watching Caden. Through the transmitter, I heard Caden's response to the press release. He paused for exactly the length of time I would have paused. Then he said, "I'll need to think about it." Those 6 words. I had said those 6 words to Dorian 2 weeks earlier, standing in my own kitchen with a burn on my chest and a $300,000 invoice on my table. Caden did not know I had said them. He arrived at them on his own by some convergence of temperament and inheritance that I have spent 30 years failing to take credit for. Dorian did not catch the echo. He never does. Lenora Voss saw the card. I watched her eyes move from the bill to my hands, and then go very still, the way a person goes still when they have just understood something they cannot yet afford to say out loud. The black anodized titanium catches light differently from across a room. She had seen that card before I suspected. Not in my hand, in another context entirely. I tucked it back into my jacket pocket, folded the chauffeur's cap under my arm, and walked out. 2 days later, I brought Caden to 77 West Wacker Drive. Nora Ellison, 38 years old, already holding a tablet loaded with the morning's acquisition reports. A woman who considers 6:30 a leisurely start, met us at the private elevator bank, with the particular alertness of someone who has been running toward a task since before most people have found their keys. She looked at Caden once, assessed him efficiently and professionally. "Good morning, Mr. G." It started as irony, that name, and became something else over time. Caden looked at me. I offered nothing. On the top floor, 200 feet above the Chicago grid, I slid the Skyline Project folder across the desk and told him what it was. An $800 million mixed-use development. LB Holdings the anonymous client. 14 firms among the bidders. I told him his evaluation of every bid would be final and binding. I told him it was not revenge, it was a test. Evaluate every bid on its merits, including theirs. If their proposal is sound, say so. If it is not, say that. What does it feel like to hand your son a folder containing $800 million worth of decisions and watch him find the flaw in your enemy's blueprint in under 5 minutes? I will tell you exactly what it feels like. It feels like 44 years of keeping a secret finally beginning to make sense. Caden looked up from the Voss blueprints and said, flat and certain, their foundation proposal has 3 structural errors. The load-bearing calculations on the northeast corner assume soil conditions that do not exist at this site. I know. That's why I needed an architect, not a lawyer. He stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows, then looking north across the loop past the North Shore until he found the Kenilworth shore. They put my photograph on the front page of the Tribune. A janitor in a work jacket taken from Aubrey's live stream camera, and the caption called, "Me the reason my son's future had been ruined." I read it twice. Then I clipped it out and pinned it to the bulletin board in my basement directly above the school photographs of Lily and Theo Webb. The scissors were in the second kitchen drawer, where I keep them next to the takeout menus I never use and a roll of packing tape I have owned since 2011. The coffee beside the Tribune was instant, and it had gone cold while I read. I did not reheat it. I want to be precise about the condition. Of that morning, it was a Tuesday. The kitchen was quiet, my work jacket was hanging on the chair behind me, and I read the front page of a major Chicago newspaper describing my son's moral clarity as a catastrophe, and my primary response was to look for the scissors. Richard Blackwood, 53 years old, senior litigation partner at Blackwood & Crane, LLP, had filed the suit at 9:03 a.m. In Cook County legal circles, they call him the Hammer. 147 consecutive civil wins, 0 losses, $1,800 per hour, and a $600,000 retainer that Dorian Voss had signed that morning with the practiced confidence of a man spending money he believes is his. The Tribune had the filing by 10. The photograph, my photograph from Aubrey's live stream. The work jacket clear in the frame ran above the fold with a caption that called me the custodian, whose son had abandoned the Voss family's daughter at the altar and caused documented and ongoing emotional damages. I read the caption flat the way you read a thing you already knew was coming. Then I said quietly in an empty kitchen, Richard Blackwood, 147 wins, 0 losses. He is about to lose his first. Let me tell you something about what it means to see your own photograph on the front page of a newspaper, under a caption that calls you a burden. It means they have decided you are not a threat. And the moment your enemy decides you are not a threat is the moment you have already won. They just do not know it yet. The retainer check Dorian signed that morning was drawn from an account partially collateralized by debt LB Holdings had owned since Tuesday. He had paid me to sue me. I almost called to thank him. I took the clipping downstairs. My basement command center runs on 12 monitors and filtered air, and the particular silence of a room where nothing happens by accident. I pinned the Tribune clipping to the bulletin board between the Forbes cover, the 2019 one, with the headline reading, "The Ghost of Chicago Real Estate." My name absent from the cover because I had asked them to leave it off, and the school photographs of Lily Webb, age 8, and Theo Webb, age 5. The bulletin board is not sentiment, it is a map. Every item on it connects to every other item, and the Tribune clipping fit between the Forbes cover and the school photographs, the way a key fits a lock it was made for. I had been at the monitors for approximately 40 minutes when the footage appeared on the afternoon feed. Cook County Courthouse, steps 11:14 a.m. Lenora Voss, in a cashmere coat and diamonds that had no business being worn to a courthouse before noon, was descending the front steps when she went down. The news headline was up by noon. Mother of jilted bride suffers cardiac event. Family blames. Stress from wedding abandonment. The cameras had been tipped 30 minutes before it happened. Philip Ashford's researcher confirmed pulled the registration logs for every press credential that cleared courthouse security that morning. 14 press passes for a routine filing. The Voss family had sent invitations. Have you ever watched someone perform grief so well that for exactly 3 seconds you almost believed it, and then your eye catches the hand that reaches out to protect the jewelry, and the whole performance collapses into what it actually is, a calculation dressed as a feeling? I watched the footage once at full speed. Then I went back to the moment of the fall and watched it again slowly, and then I paused it. Her right hand went out, not to break the fall, to protect the bracelet. $14,000 on her left wrist, and her first instinct in the middle of a cardiac episode she was performing was to make sure it did not hit the concrete. The right hand extended fingers spread weight, distributed the involuntary geometry of a woman protecting an asset. The left wrist angled away from the step's edge with a precision that no genuine physical collapse produces. I paused on the frame. Then I picked up the phone and called Philip Ashford. I asked him who owned the parent company of Northwestern Lakeview Medical Center. He said a Boston private equity firm in financial distress for 6 months exploring a sale. I said accelerate the close. I want the morning after Philip Ashford filed the transfer documents. My son and I walked through the front entrance of Northwestern Lakeview Medical Center, a building whose board of directors had not yet been informed that their ownership had changed overnight. And I will tell you that there is a specific pleasure in walking into a room that does not yet know it belongs to you. The lobby was what Gold Coast medical money looks like when it is trying not to look like money. White marble floors, orchids in the entrance alcoves changed every Tuesday. A donor recognition screen on the far wall cycling through names and gift amounts in a tasteful sans serif font. The hush that a building produces when wealth and illness have agreed to pretend they are the same thing. My work jacket did not belong there, according to every visual cue the lobby had been designed to communicate. I have never found that particular communication difficult to ignore. Dr. Conrad Halsey, 51 years old, Chief Administrative Officer of Northwestern Lakeview Medical Center, stepped into the administrative corridor ahead of us with the practiced authority of a man who has spent 2 decades deciding who belongs where. One look at my work jacket told him everything he believed he needed to know. He moved to the center of the corridor, squared his posture, and began a sentence with the word "sir" in a tone that has ended the progress of a great many people through a great many corridors. Philip Ashford extended his arm and handed Halsey the tablet before the sentence could finish. Watch what happens when a man discovers his building has a new owner, who belongs in which corridor of his building is handed a tablet, showing that the building itself has a new owner. I want you to count the seconds. It takes 4. Halsey's posture changed on the second. A small collapse in the shoulders, a recalibration in the eyes, and by the 4th second, he had stepped aside, tablet still in his hand, and said nothing further. I nodded at him once. Caden watched without a word. We proceeded. Lenora's medical chart was in the nursing station adjacent to the VIP suite corridor. I read it standing up, one hand on the counter, the way I read documents I already expect to say exactly what they say. The admitting notes were clinical and precise. No evidence of cardiac event. No evidence of arrhythmia. No evidence of any acute medical emergency consistent with the presenting complaint. And then in the attending physician's supplemental notes, a line that I read twice, not because I was surprised, but because I wanted to make sure I had the vintage correct. For the bill, patient requested privacy, and a bottle of 2019 Sancerre cited personal preference. The chart read no evidence of cardiac event. No evidence of arrhythmia. Patient requested a bottle of 2019 Sancerre. I closed the chart. I asked the hospital's IT manager, a 29-year-old named Derek, who had been at his desk since 6:30 and had not yet been informed about the ownership change, to patch the VIP suite camera feed to the donor recognition screen in the lobby. He looked at Ashford. Ashford nodded. Derek patched the feed. Richard Blackwood had set up his press conference in the lobby at 11. Podium microphone, 2 printed statements, and a backdrop that positioned the donor recognition screen directly behind him. The architect of that particular staging choice had not considered that the screen's display content was no longer under the management of the previous ownership. I stood to the left of the lobby's secondary entrance and waited. Blackwood was 4 minutes into a prepared statement about the emotional and professional devastation caused by the Greer family's actions when the donor recognition screen changed. Do you know what 3 seconds of silence sounds like in a hospital lobby full of press cameras? When the screen behind the attorney crying into a microphone shows his client doing a small dance in a hospital gown, wine glass raised. Entirely unbothered by the cardiac emergency, she has been described as suffering for the past 18 hours. It sounds like the exact moment a story stops being what one side of it was trying to make it. The cameras did not turn immediately. There were 3 full seconds of absolute stillness while every person in that lobby processed what they were seeing. Then the cameras turned. The mechanical sound of press tripods rotating is something I will remember with particular clarity. I walked to the lobby microphone. I said, "Mrs. Voss appears to have made a miraculous recovery. She will be discharged immediately. Here is her bill." I set the itemized statement on the podium. It was 2 pages. The line items were standard hospital charges, the room, the attending, the monitoring equipment that had detected nothing because there was nothing to detect. The bottom line on page 2 included 1 bottle of 2019 Sancerre at $340. Blackwood stepped away from the podium without a word. That was the right professional decision. I noted it. I was turning from the microphone when I saw Lenora in the corridor doorway behind the lobby. She had been discharged. She was in her street clothes, the cashmere coat, the diamonds returned to their positions, the Cartier bracelet back on her left wrist. She was looking at me from across the lobby with an expression that was not anger and was not embarrassment. I want to tell you about the afternoon I watched Dorian Voss lose his last investor meeting without leaving my basement, because the most important thing I can show you about power is not what it looks like when you use it, but what it looks like when you never had to be in the room at all. 4 days had passed since Northwestern Lakeview. I had not spoken to Lenora. I had not needed to. The afternoon news coverage had handled the conversation I would have had with her, and the morning coverage after that had handled everything her attorney might have added. What I had done instead in those 4 days was watch Dorian. I do not mean watch him methodically without sentiment. I mean watch him the way a builder watches a structure that is past the point where reinforcement helps methodically without sentiment, noting which load-bearing element will go first. On September 25th, Dorian drove to the Lakewood Club in Lake Forest to meet 3 New York venture capitalists who had agreed through a mutual connection in his contact list to evaluate what his materials described as a high-value distressed acquisition opportunity. He arrived 14 minutes early. I know this because I opened the Lakewood Club security feed on my center monitor at 2:15 and watched him enter the private meeting room, set his presentation binders on the table with the focused precision of a man performing competence, and arrange his materials in the order of a pitch he had rehearsed. 3 binders, a printed summary sheet, a bottle of water he had brought himself because he did not want to be seen ordering from the club while his guests were in the room. Watching a man pitch investors he no longer has access to is like watching someone knock on the door of a house they sold 3 weeks ago. The confidence is intact. The key still fits the lock in their memory, and the moment of understanding is still coming. I had acquired controlling stakes in 2 of the 3 investors' primary holding companies on September 15th, 10 days before this meeting, 10 days before Dorian had confirmed his attendees, 10 days before Dorian had finalized his binders. The Lakewood Club ambush was not assembled in response to Dorian's scheduling. It was assembled the week Philip Ashford identified who Dorian was going to call when the hospital coverage ran. The 3 investors arrived together at 2:30 in dark suits, with the particular forward lean of men who have flown in for a meeting they believe will be brief and productive. Dorian shook each hand. He thanked them for making the trip. He opened his first binder. For 10 minutes, I watched him deliver the best version of a pitch for a company whose underlying assets had been systematically restructured away from him over the preceding 6 weeks. The investors leaned forward at the first slide. They sat back at the third. Philip Ashford entered the meeting room at 2:41. He was carrying a single printed page. He placed 1 copy in front of each investor, 1 movement per person. No ceremony the way you deliver a document when the document is the entire message. He did not sit down. He said, "Gentlemen, your new corporate governance policy effective September 15th, signed by your controlling shareholder. You will find the relevant clause on line 7. Then he stepped back from the table and waited. Philip Ashford placed 1 page in front of each man. He did not explain it. He did not need to. Line 7 of a corporate governance policy is not a negotiation. It is a wall. The first investor read it in approximately 40 seconds. He looked at the second investor. The second investor was already standing. The first investor said, "We'll need to step out." They did not come back. The meeting had lasted 12 minutes. Dorian sat alone at the conference table for a moment that the security feed captured in an overhead angle. I will not forget a man at the center of a room that had just become entirely empty, with 3 binders open in front of him and a bottle of water he had brought himself. What does it tell you about a man when his response to losing his last financial lifeline is to call his attorney and say, "Destroy them," without pausing to ask who them is, or what them might already own, or whether them has been waiting for exactly this phone call to add to the documentation? I watched Dorian walk to the parking lot, phone already at his ear before the club's front door had closed behind him. The lake wind was up. His voice dropped the way voices drop when the words being said are the kind a man does not want carried. I heard him clearly through the exterior microphone. He said, "I don't know who this is. Find out and destroy them." Behind him, through the window, I could still see on the feed, Philip Ashford straightened his tie, pocketed the governance document, and walked toward the club's exit at a pace that implied he had somewhere better to be. Dorian was still on the phone. He did not see Ashford leave. I turned off the security feed. The basement was quiet in the particular way it gets quiet when something that has been running for a long time has just finished. My phone lit up Ashford. "Dorian listed the Kenilworth property this morning. Fire sale price." Fire sale price. He doesn't know we're the buyer yet. I sat with that for a moment. Then I said, give him 48 hours to understand his options. Then there is a kind of justice that does not announce itself. It arrives in a standard bank envelope on a Tuesday morning and sits on the counter of a 12-bedroom house until the man who owns the furniture opens it and understands for the first time that the furniture is the least of what he is about to lose. The foreclosure notice reached 87 Sheridan Road, Kenilworth, on September 27th. I know the exact morning because Philip Ashford had been tracking the bank's internal processing timeline for 3 weeks, and when the certified envelope cleared the postal route at 7:49 a.m., He sent me a single word delivered. I was at the kitchen table on Calumet Avenue drinking coffee that was actually hot for once. And I read that word the way you read a confirmation for something you ordered a long time ago and nearly forgot was coming. I want you to understand something about the foreclosure notice. It was not the first one. There had been a grace period then, a warning. Then a final notice, 3 documents over 6 weeks that Dorian had been responding to with the confidence of a man who believed he would find money before the bank moved. He was right about the timeline. He was wrong about whose money it would be. By the time the certified envelope arrived, the listing had already gone up $3.8 million, a $2. $4 million discount on a property appraised at $6.2 million, photographed in the particular flattering light that real estate agents use when they know the seller is moving fast. Ashford called the listing agent that same afternoon. Cash offer $2.1 million, closing in 10 days leaseback at $12,000 per month. Triple net, 72-hour eviction trigger on non-payment. Dorian's real estate attorney, a voice on the phone, confident in his opening position and noticeably quieter by the end of his second sentence, called the offer insulting. Ashford let him finish. Then Ashford said 7 words: the foreclosure sale will yield 1.4. There was a pause of the particular kind that follows an arithmetic argument a professional cannot contest. Dorian accepted the offer 2 hours later. The closing was scheduled for 10 days out. Ashford messaged me the confirmation at 4:22 p.m. I read it, set my phone face down on the desk, and went back to the legal pad I had been working on. The leaseback agreement was 14 pages. Dorian's attorney reviewed pages 1 through 8 and the signature block. He did not read page 9. He signed page 7. He did not read page 9. Page 9, clause 4, BA subsection 2, all furnishings, fixtures, artwork, and installed equipment are included in the purchase price and transfer with the deed. He signed his grandmother's Chippendale chairs to me for $2.1 million and did not know it until the movers arrived. I did not point this out at signing. A man who has spent his career reading the fine print of other people's contracts signs his own on confidence and a trusted attorney. I had been counting on the confidence. The attorney was simply a bonus. I approved the welcome packet contents the evening before the closing confirmation came through. The packet is a standard LB Holdings tenant onboarding document, return address on the envelope, first month's invoice on top. Standard terms on the back, a tenant welcome letter. For the Kenilworth property, I made one adjustment to the standard template. I specified cheap fruit for the basket. Not promotional fruit, the kind that arrives in cellophane with a ribbon. The kind that sits at the bottom of a grocery display and turns soft at the stems within a day. What is the correct fruit for a welcome basket sent to a man who burned your chest with coffee in his kitchen, demanded $300,000 at your table, and then sold you his house without reading the contract? I thought about it. I chose the kind that turns in a day. The packet arrived at 87 Sheridan Road the morning after closing. A courier knock, quiet, professional, the kind of knock that implies no urgency because urgency is not necessary. Dorian opened it at the same kitchen table where 26 days earlier he had set a $300,000 invoice in front of me and smiled. The invoice on top was crisp, freshly printed standard LB Holdings header. In the payee field in clean 12-point type, the name read Walter Greer. He set the invoice down. He stared at it. The fruit basket was below it, a small arrangement stone fruit, adjacent already beginning to soften at the stems. I was watching through the kitchen window feed on my tablet, and I will tell you that the 12 seconds Dorian spent looking at my name on that invoice were the quietest 12 seconds of this entire story. I have made hundreds of phone calls from this kitchen over 44 years. Calls that moved money across state lines, calls that closed acquisitions, calls that ended careers. The call I made at 8:14 p.m. on the 28th of September was the only one I was nervous about. Not because of what I was asking, because of who I was asking it from. I had been sitting at the kitchen table for an hour before I dialed. Not because I did not know what to say. I had written out the structure on my legal pad the same way I prepare for any important conversation. The identification, the disclosure, the offer. They ask in that order. I was nervous for a different reason. I was nervous because Marcus Webb had done nothing wrong. He had not engineered anything, or manipulated anyone, or leveraged a situation to his advantage. He had simply been a father, holding a family together in Pittsburgh on double shifts for 2.5 years. And I was about to call him and ask him to fly his children to Chicago and sit in a courtroom and testify to the worst thing that had ever happened to his family. The legal pad did not have anything on it to address that. Let me tell you something about Marcus Webb before he speaks. He answered on the third ring, not the first, which would have been eager, and not after 5, which would have been fear. 3 rings is a man who is deciding whether to answer at all. That told me everything I needed to know about him before he uttered a word. His hello was flat and careful, the greeting of someone who has learned that unknown numbers in the evening are rarely good news. I identified myself. My name is Walter Greer. I am the father of the man your wife tried to marry. I know about Lily and Theo. I know about March 2022. And I know that you have been holding everything together alone for 2.5 years without asking anyone for anything. There was a silence. Not the silence of confusion or anger. The silence of a man deciding how much danger this call represented. I let it sit. I have found in 44 years that the temptation to fill another person's silence is almost always a mistake. The silence belongs to them. What they do with it tells you something that the question never would. What do you want from me? I told him what I knew and what I could prove. I told him about the trial on October 15th, about the $5 million civil suit, about the witnesses the Voss family's attorney had assembled. I told him about the job at LB Holdings Facilities Management at $85,000 per year. The $50,000 education fund for each child deposited the morning after the trial. The hotel suite in Chicago on October 14th paid so his children could sleep before the courtroom. I told him I was asking him to testify to the facts, only the facts, nothing he had not lived himself. He went quiet for a long time after I finished. Not the silence of someone deciding whether to believe me. The silence of someone who has been alone with something very heavy for 2.5 years and has just been told that someone else has been carrying part of it without being asked. I recognized that silence. I had made it myself in a different kitchen in a different year. When someone I did not expect to understand, something had understood it completely. Then his voice came back cautious. Why are you helping me? You don't know me. What do you say to a man who asks that when the true answer is because your daughter has her father's eyes, and ask me a question in a hotel lobby photograph that I have not been able to stop? Thinking about since the first time I saw her school picture pinned to a PI report in February, I did not offer that. I gave him what was also true. I know your children deserve a father who can give them a stable life, and my son deserves to know the truth about the woman he almost married. Those were both true. They were just not the only true thing. He was quiet again. Then, will this protect my kids? It will end the ability of anyone to use them as leverage ever again. Another silence, shorter than the others, the silence of a calculation completed. All right, I exhaled slowly. I will have someone contact you tomorrow with the details. A pause on his end then. Okay. I added quietly, Mr. Webb, thank you. He did not respond to that. He hung up. I sat at the table for a moment with the phone in my hand. 22 minutes, the longest call I had made from this kitchen in years, and neither of us had raised our voices once. I went downstairs. I stood in front of the bulletin board, Lily and Theo's school photographs in the center, the Tribune clipping above them, the Forbes cover below. I put my fingers on Lily's photograph, barely touching the corner of it. A child in a school photograph does not know she is evidence of anything. She is just a child on a Tuesday morning in a yellow jacket. I studied that photograph for a long time. Then I spoke to the room and the server hum and the 12 monitors and 44 years of a plan I had been building since before her father learned to hold everything together alone. October 15th. The trial was 18 days away. I picked up the phone again. I called Philip Ashford. I think we may have a cooperating witness on their side before the trial. He was quiet for a moment. Then, Lenora. I considered it. I don't know yet, but the call lasted 40 seconds and she hung up first. Ashford's response came measured. I'll start preparing for both possibilities. I agreed. Yes, do that. I set the phone on the desk. The basement was quiet except for the low frequency of the server racks. I walked into the most expensive law firm in Chicago, wearing a jacket that still smelled like industrial floor cleaner, and I let the receptionist decide what kind of man I was. She was approximately 26 precise in her posture and accustomed to deciding in 4 seconds whether a visitor belonged. I watched her run the calculation, the jacket, the unhurried pace, the absence of a briefcase, and arrive at her conclusion. She asked politely whether I had the correct building. I told her I had an appointment with Richard Blackwood. She asked again in a slightly different way whether I was certain. I told her I was. She made a call. I stood at the reception desk of Blackwood and Crane LLP on the 41st floor of 875 North Michigan Avenue and looked at the view of the lake and thought about the morning in 1987 when I signed the deed on my first property 3 blocks south of where I was standing. Blackwood came out himself. I had expected that. A man with 147 consecutive wins does not send an associate to meet the defendant in a $5 million suit. He comes personally, because the personal appearance is itself a performance of confidence. And confidence has won him as many cases as preparation has. He was in a Navy suit. He moved with the particular economy of someone who has been in expensive rooms long enough to stop performing ease and simply have it. He looked at my jacket once. He did not look at it again. Let me tell you what $1,800 an hour looks like. When it is surprised, it looks exactly like $12 an hour, just in a better suit. He offered me $180,000 to drop all counterclaims. He called it a goodwill gesture. He said it resolved things cleanly for everyone involved. I noted the word everyone, which was doing a great deal of work in that sentence. I let him finish the offer completely. I waited for the silence that followed. Then I said, "I appreciate the offer." Judge Miller's courtroom. October 15th. I said it in 11 words, flat final. I picked up my jacket from the chair I had placed it on. I walked to the elevator. Behind me, Blackwood said, "That's Mr. Greer. Wait." I pressed the lobby button. The elevator doors closed with a precision click that I found deeply satisfying. The faint metallic taste at the back of my mouth, walking out through the brass door onto Michigan Avenue, was the same one I had registered the morning I signed my first deed in 1987. I had not identified it then. I identified it now. It is the taste of a decision that cannot be unmade. I had 13 days before the trial. I spent them the way I have always spent the days before, something I have been building toward for a long time, working the mop route on Tuesdays and Thursdays, answering Nora's morning reports, reviewing Cadence Skyline evaluations, sleeping 7 hours. I did not review my legal strategy obsessively. The strategy was complete. What was not complete was the thing I had been thinking about since the basement bulletin board, the school photographs, the Tribune clipping the Forbes cover, and the 11 words I said to Marcus Webb on the 28th of September that I was not entirely certain I could keep. Marcus Webb shook my hand in the Kimpton Gray Hotel lobby at 7:55 p.m. on October 14th, and I realized I had never planned for the moment someone thanked me. He was in a gray button-down shirt, the careful dress of a man who has thought about what to wear to a meeting he does not fully understand but wants to take seriously. He said, "My kids know nothing except that we are helping somebody tell the truth. That's all they need to know. That's all any of us need to know." Then I looked past his shoulder. Lily Webb is 8 years old and was wearing a yellow coat. She held a folded piece of notebook paper with both hands as though it were something official. Theo Webb is 5 and stayed close to his father's left side and said nothing during the entire meeting. Marcus confirmed he was ready to testify. We sat in the bronze-lit lobby for 40 minutes and talked about the logistics of the morning, what time to arrive, where to park, which entrance to use, the way two people discuss practical matters when the emotional weight of the conversation is too large to carry directly. The Kimpton Gray's revolving door brought cold October air through the lobby every few minutes, and I was grateful for it. What do you do when the most honest thing said to you in 14 months is written in green crayon on notebook paper by a child who does not know your net worth? I did not know the answer to that. Question at 8:47 p.m. on October 14th. I only knew that when I turned to leave and felt a small tug at my sleeve and looked down at Lily Webb, extending the folded paper toward me with both hands, and saying nothing, I took it. I unfolded it under the hotel corridor light. 5 words, green crayon, block letters. I stood under that fluorescent corridor light for 3 seconds, which is not a long time by any ordinary measure, but a legal pad rested on the defendant's table, uncapped 1 pen, and sat down. No briefcase, no attorney, no paralegal. Richard Blackwood studied me from across the courtroom, the way a man studies something he has already decided is beneath him, and I let him. Judge Margaret Miller is 58 years old, enters without theater, and runs her courtroom with the economy of someone who has heard every performance before. She took her seat at 9:02 a.m., confirmed the case number noted for the record that the defendant was representing himself, and gave Blackwood the floor. He used 12 minutes of it. I have heard a great many opening statements in my life, not from a courtroom chair, but from a basement command center, through transcripts and audio files, and Blackwood's was technically excellent. Structured, emotionally calibrated, built for the press gallery as much as the bench. He called me a bitter, jealous man who would rather burn his son's future than admit he had been left behind. I wrote 1 sentence on my legal pad. I underlined it twice. I set the pen down. I want you to understand what it costs a man to sit still while someone constructs a lie about him piece by piece in front of his son. The answer is nothing. If the lie is built on a foundation you already own, it costs you nothing to let it be completed. I had written 7 words on the legal pad. The visible fragment, if anyone had leaned close enough, read, "Let them finish building the box." Judge Miller asked if I wished to respond to the opening statement. No, Your Honor, not yet. The 14 witnesses arrived in sequence. The wedding planner testified about erratic last-minute demands. The florist testified about canceled orders and abrupt communications. 3 Voss family associates testified to my alleged financial manipulation of events preceding the wedding. The financial analyst produced charts. Aubrey Voss testified with the composure of someone who has rehearsed sincerity. Dorian testified with the confidence of a man who has never been seriously cross-examined. Lenora testified last among the family, briefly, carefully, with 2 fewer details than I had expected her to include. After each witness, Judge Miller turned to me. Each time I offered the same 4 words, "No questions, Your Honor." I delivered them 14 times. I watched Blackwood's smirk solidify across the morning and calcify by early afternoon into something he had stopped performing and started believing. I watched Caden in the 3rd row, his hands tightening in his lap. By the 4th witness, by the 8th, his jaw set. By the 12th, his eyes moving between me and the legal pad, with an expression I recognized as the frustration of a son watching his father do something he cannot explain. Do you know what 14 witnesses and 6 hours of testimony sounds like when you have already decided not to argue with any of it? It sounds like a foundation being poured. Each testimony was a layer. Each unchallenged accusation was a brick placed exactly where I needed it placed. The box was being built carefully and expensively by the best civil litigator in Cook County, and I had been waiting for it to be finished since February. At 3:28 p.m., Blackwood's co-counsel leaned toward him and wrote something on her notepad. I was watching from across the courtroom, and I could read the word. It was surrender with a question mark, which told me she was less certain than her client. I did not move. I did not change the position of my hands on the legal pad. I noted the word and offered nothing. Before I tell you what Walter answered next, the one word that rewrites 6 hours of silence, drop your answer in the comments. 1, if you think the silence was surrender. 2, if you think it was a trap, and add 1 sentence explaining how you read him. A quick note, what follows contains recreated courtroom details adapted for storytelling purposes. The lesson is what I hope stays with you. At 3:30 p.m., Judge Miller studied me with the expression of a judge who has given a defendant every procedural opportunity available to him and is now required to move toward resolution. Mr. Greer, do you have any defense to present? Eu estás desabuos. It for bore. I set the pen down. I straightened the legal pad, so its left edge aligned with the table's edge, a habit I have had since the first time I signed a contract and wanted my hands to be doing something precise. I stood up. The courtroom produced a sound that was not quite silence and not quite noise, the specific acoustic of 200 people adjusting to something they did not expect. Yes, Your Honor, I'd like to call my first witness. Judge Miller paused. Who? Myself. The word landed in the courtroom like a dropped gavel. I watched Richard Blackwood's smirk leave his face for the first time in 6 hours. Not replaced by alarm, not replaced by calculation, simply absent. The way an expression leaves when the body needs a moment to find the correct one. His co-counsel's pen stopped moving. In the 3rd row, I did not turn toward Caden. I did not need to. I picked up my pen. Every person in that courtroom was holding something breath pen phone, the careful arrangement of an assumption that had just become structurally unsound. The walk from the defendant's table to the witness stand is 14 steps. I counted them the night before standing in my kitchen in Bronzeville because I wanted to know exactly how long I had before Richard Blackwood started dismantling me, or thought he did. I took all 14 steps at 3:47 p.m. I kept the work jacket on. I had considered removing it before taking the stand and decided against it not as a performance but because the jacket was the argument. If I removed it, his cross-examination was technically excellent and entirely predictable. Annual income approximately $31,000. Correct. No significant declared personal assets. Correct. No legal counsel retained for these proceedings. Correct. Each answer I gave him was the truth. I want to be precise about that, not a strategic truth or a partial truth, but a complete and documentable fact. Walter Greer individual earns $31,000 per year from the janitorial service contract he has held since 1984. Walter Greer individual holds no significant declared personal assets. These things are accurate. What Blackwood was doing was treating the individual as the entirety, which is an assumption that works in most rooms. I want you to understand what I was doing while Blackwood listed my income. I was counting the buildings he could see from his office window on the 41st floor of 875 North Michigan Avenue. 3 of them had my name on the deed, not Walter Greer's name, LB Holdings' name. which is structurally and legally the same thing, but that distinction requires a conversation Blackwood had not yet been given the information to have. He pivoted at 3:58 p.m. I recognize the pivot because his cadence changed the rhythm of a cross-examination that has been building toward a summary statement, shifts in the final 30 seconds. And I had been listening to Blackwood's rhythm for 6 hours. He began his summary sentence. I unbuttoned the jacket's second button. I did not stand yet. I let the watch become visible first, the Patek Philippe Calatrava on my left wrist, the one I bought in Geneva in 2011, the week after the LB Holdings portfolio crossed 800 million. I watched Blackwood's cadence hesitate for exactly 2 syllables. Then I stood. 372 properties, $1.2 billion. I am not the bank counselor. I am the building. The courtroom went still. Not the polite stillness of ceremony, the stillness of 200 people revising every assumption they had held for 6 hours. Not shock is loud. This was the quiet of 200 people simultaneously revising a conclusion they had been holding for 6 hours. Judge Miller turned to Blackwood. Blackwood stared at the watch. I kept my hands at my sides. Judge Miller's voice cut through. Mr. Blackwood, do you wish to continue cross-examination? He did not answer immediately, which was, for a man with his record, the answer. What does $1,800 an hour feel like when the man paying it used your own money to do it? I imagine it feels exactly like the moment Blackwood's phone lit up during the recess. He was in the corridor outside courtroom 1704 with his co-counsel when Philip Ashford presented the documentation. The retainer account origination, the transfer trail, the LB Holdings connection, 3 institutions back. From my seat, I watched Blackwood read the phone screen, set it face down on the corridor bench, and remain still for approximately 8 seconds. A man with 147 wins processes reversals quickly. 8 seconds was the entire processing time. He requested a sidebar at 4:09 p.m. He spoke to Judge Miller for 4 minutes. He returned to the plaintiff's table, exchanged 3 sentences with Dorian Voss, and walked to the bench. Your Honor, the plaintiff moves to withdraw all claims with prejudice. He withdrew. 14 years, 147 wins, and he withdrew. Dorian Voss did not stand when Blackwood spoke. He remained at the plaintiff's table, motionless in his seat. Aubrey was beside him. Neither of them turned toward me. Judge Miller noted the withdrawal for the record, confirmed the prejudice designation, thanked the parties, and adjourned. The press gallery began filing out with the particular energy of people who need to rewrite something before deadline. Blackwood walked past the plaintiff's table without stopping. He walked to the defendant's table. He stopped. He extended his hand. I stood and took it, brief, firm, dry, professional. Well played, Mr. Greer. I nodded once. You built a strong case with the materials you were given. He studied me for a moment in the way that people study something, when they are recalibrating the full scope of what they did not know. Then he walked out. I sat back down. The courtroom was emptying. Dorian Voss remained at the plaintiff's table, hands folded, the particular stillness of a man who has run out of next moves and has not yet decided what to do with the stillness. I did not turn toward Caden. I focused on the legal pad. Then I heard the briefcase clasp open beside me, the seat that had been empty for the entire trial. Philip Ashford set the briefcase on the table and sat down. He offered nothing. I offered nothing. We studied the emptying courtroom together for a moment. Dorian Voss was still examining his hands. Then Caden appeared at the end of the defendant's table. He did not sit. He stood there with his hands at his sides, the posture of someone who has just watched something they cannot yet name. I rose from my chair. Neither of us spoke for a moment. Then he stepped forward and we held each other, not the embrace of celebration, but the embrace of 2 people who have just crossed a bridge that nearly collapsed under them and are standing on the other side, confirming they are both still there. His voice, when it came, was quiet enough that only I could hear it. I'm sorry I didn't believe you. I kept one hand on his shoulder. You believed what you could see. That's all anyone can do. We stood there for another moment. The courtroom had mostly emptied. The late afternoon light came through the tall windows in long amber bands across the polished floor. Philip Ashford closed his briefcase with a quiet click and stood nodding once to both of us before walking toward the exit. Dorian Voss had... Judge Miller was preparing to close the session when I said, Your Honor, I have one final piece of evidence. Philip Ashford stood from the gallery. He had been sitting in the 7th row, silent and motionless for the entire afternoon, and walked to the defendant's table. He handed me a single flash drive standard commercial model, the kind you purchase at any office supply store for $12. I carried it to the bench. Judge Miller accepted it without comment, inserted it into the courtroom's audio system, and adjusted the volume control. The recording began at 5:38 p.m. The voice on the recording was Dorian Voss's, clear, unhurried, entirely confident. The voice of a man speaking in a room he believes is private to people he believes share his interests. The audio quality was excellent, no distortion, no ambient noise to obscure the words. Philip had paid for professional equipment. Dorian's voice said, "We use the Sun to co-sign the operating loan. He won't question it if he thinks it's his idea. The timing's crucial. We need him legally bound before the old man figures out we're underwater. This marriage isn't romance, Richard. It's a financial restructuring with a ceremony attached." A second voice I recognized it as Richard Thorne, Dorian's business partner. The one who had sat beside him at 3 separate meetings I had documented said, "And if the Sun realizes what he's signing," Dorian's voice said he won't. "He's already convinced his father is the problem. We just keep reinforcing that narrative. The old man's a janitor. The Sun's embarrassed." Embarrassment is leverage if you know how to apply it correctly. 6 months, maybe 8, we'll have $40 million in debt under the Sun's signature, and the father won't be able to do anything except watch his son pay for our mistakes. Richard's voice said, "What about the daughter? Does she know?" Dorian's voice said, "Aubrey knows what she needs to know. She's good at playing the part. That's all we need from her until the paperwork clears." The recording lasted 1 minute and 11 seconds. When it ended, the courtroom held a silence that required no description from me. You could measure it in the absence of movement, 200 people motionless, processing what they had just heard. Dorian Voss at the plaintiff's table did not flinch. That is the detail I remember with greatest clarity, not the words on the recording, but the absence of visible surprise in his face. He had said those words. He remembered saying them. The only thing that surprised him was that the conversation had been preserved. Judge Miller looked at the plaintiff's table and said, "Mr. Voss, do you dispute the authenticity of that recording?" Dorian's attorney, not Blackwood, who had withdrawn 4 hours earlier, but the associate who had been sitting beside Dorian since mid-afternoon, stood and said, "Your Honor, we would need time to verify the chain of custody and authenticate the audio before we could respond to its admissibility." Judge Miller said noted. "Mr. Ashford, when was this recording made?" Philip stood and said, "July 19th, 2024, at approximately 7:40 p.m. at the offices of Voss Development, 1400 West Fulton Street." The recording was made by a private investigator retained by the defendant, operating under Illinois eavesdropping statutes which permit recording when one party to the conversation has consented or when the recording occurs in furtherance of documenting a crime. The investigator was present in the room as contracted maintenance staff. Mr. Voss and Mr. Thorne were aware of his presence but not his recording capability. Judge Miller said, "Was the investigator party to the conversation?" Philip said, "No, Your Honor. However, the conversation explicitly references intent to commit wire fraud and elder financial abuse, both of which are felonies under Illinois and federal law. The recording falls within the crime fraud exception to Illinois' 2-party consent requirement." Judge Miller looked at the recording device for a long moment. Then she said, "I am referring this matter to the Cook County State's Attorney for investigation of wire fraud conspiracy to commit fraud and attempted elder financial abuse under Illinois, Statute 720, ILCS 5/16 1.1. I am also referring Mr. Richard Thorne for investigation as a co-conspirator. This civil case is dismissed with prejudice. The plaintiff's claims are denied in their entirety." She brought the gavel down at 5:41 p.m. Dorian remained at the plaintiff's table for approximately 20 seconds after the gavel. His attorney was gathering files, moving with the efficient haste of someone who needs to leave a room quickly. 2 Cook County deputies approached from the side entrance, not to arrest, not yet, but to escort. Dorian stood when they reached him. He buttoned his suit jacket with movements that were slow and deliberate. The movements of a man who has run out of next steps and is performing composure, because composure is the last tool available. As he passed the defendant's table, he did not look at me. He looked straight ahead at the courtroom doors at the corridor beyond, where the press gallery was already gathering with cameras raised. I watched him walk the entire distance. I did not say anything. There was nothing left that required saying. The deputies held the doors. Dorian walked through. The doors closed behind him with a pneumatic hiss that carried across the emptying courtroom. Philip Ashford returned to his seat in the gallery. Judge Miller exited through the side door. The court reporter powered down her machine. I sat motionless, and I thought about a recording made in July that I had carried through August and September without playing for my son, because some kinds of truth need courtrooms to be believed. I want to tell you what it felt like to knock on a door I owned, knowing the man inside had once studied me and decided I was furniture. It did not feel like victory. It felt like arithmetic, a long equation, finally quietly balanced. I drove north on Lakeshore Drive at 8:17 a.m., with the windows down, which I do not normally do in October, but the morning was the kind of clear that does not ask permission. The F-150 has 214,000 miles on it and makes a sound at highway speed that I have never had diagnosed because I find it reliable company. I took the Edens north to Kenilworth and pulled up to 87 Sheridan Road at 9 a.m. I had owned the deed for 19 days. I knocked twice. Dorian answered in a bathrobe. He examined me the way people examine something when they are expecting a process server or a neighbor, and receive instead the specific face of the thing they built their entire strategy against. He was standing in the doorway of a house whose cleaning service now sent invoices to my accounts payable department. I offered nothing first. I let him process. I genuinely thought you were nothing. I know. He sat down on the steps. I did not wait to watch him sit. Some things you do not need to see to know they happened. I walked back to the truck, started the engine, and pulled away from the curb without checking the rearview mirror. The equation was balanced. The arithmetic did not require a witness. Lou Mitchell's has been on West Jackson Boulevard since 1923 and smells the way a restaurant smells, when it has been doing the same thing well for a very long time: coffee and butter and the warmth of a griddle that has never been cold. I got there first and took the booth by the window. Caden arrived at 10:22 a.m. Marcus and the children arrived at 10:27 a.m. Theo in front, as he apparently prefers. Let me tell you what it looks like when a 5-year-old offers a grown man a bite of his pancake. It looks like the entire point of everything. Caden had knelt in the restaurant aisle to speak to Lily at her level. He spoke to her in a voice I could not fully hear. Lily considered it with the full gravity of an 8-year-old who has been raised to take honesty seriously. Then her response came clear. Daddy says mistakes are how people learn if they're willing to be honest. Caden held her gaze for a moment. Your daddy is right. Lily nodded, apparently satisfied, and returned to her eggs. Theo, who had been watching this with the detached assessment of a 5-year-old determining whether a situation requires his involvement, extended his fork toward Caden with a piece of chocolate chip pancake on it. Caden took the bite. I watched this from across the table and felt something settle in my chest that I recognized as the weight of a thing being completed correctly. Marcus studied the blueprint for 12 seconds. I had brought it in a cardboard tube and unrolled it on the laminate table between the coffee cups and Theo's plate, the full architectural rendering of the Webb Family Community Center. Ground floor and second floor, the Kenilworth stone facade retained the interior, rebuilt for 150 people. At capacity, a trade education wing, a child care room, a library. His thumb moved to the bottom of the director's line, where the name Field read Marcus A. Webb, Founding Director. He had not been searching for his name. He found it the way you find something that was placed where you would eventually turn your attention. He lifted his gaze to meet mine across the table. He did not speak for a moment. Then, all right, the blueprint was still flat on the table, with Marcus's thumb on the director line. Outside the window, West Jackson Boulevard carried Chicago toward another ordinary Wednesday. The center would be built. The name was already on the paper. The question Marcus had not yet asked why his name was there before he agreed sat between us in the way of questions that answer themselves if you wait long enough. I was prepared to wait. Marcus asked me 3 days later. He said, "Why was my name already on that line?" I said, "Because the answer was always going to be yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "All right." It was the second time he had said it in 3 days, and it meant the same thing. Both times, not enthusiasm, but the weight of a man who has decided to trust a calculation he cannot yet fully verify. I have built entire financial structures on that kind of trust. It is the most durable kind. In late October, Caden went to 87 Sheridan Road for the first structural assessment of the Webb Center conversion. He told me about it the following evening at the kitchen table, with the precision of a man reporting professional information, which is how I knew it was also personal. Simone Garrett is 31 years old, the Webb Center's lead community architect, and is the kind of person who concedes a technical argument in 4 words and returns to work without requiring the moment to mean anything more than it does. She had been on site since 7 in the morning. Caden arrived at 9. They disagreed about a load-bearing wall within 20 minutes of meeting. Caden had the 1923 blueprint. Simone had the 2019 renovation survey. He was correct. She checked his source, said 2 words, "You're right," and went back to her clipboard. He came back the next morning without being asked. I had arranged their overlap 3 weeks earlier, but I had not arranged that wall. Some things you cannot engineer, and it is important to know which things those are. I did not go to the site the morning Lenora Voss arrived for her first day of community service. I heard about it the way I hear about most things after the fact, from someone who was there and did not think it was remarkable. That is the detail I keep returning to, not the act itself, the unremarkable quality of it. It was a Tuesday in March 2025, the kind of morning where the light over Kenilworth sits flat and gray. Simone told me later that Lenora pulled up in a used 2018 Civic and walked to the folding table we had set up near the chain-link gate on Sheridan Road. She had a court reporting slip folded in her coat pocket, the community service assignment stamped in blue ink with a Cook County seal, and she handed it to Simone without ceremony. Simone looked at the slip, looked at Lenora, and handed her a work vest. Yellow. The kind with the reflective stripe across the chest. She told her where the supply closet was and what time the afternoon shift ended, and that was the whole transaction. I am not going to tell you what that means. You already know what it means. I did not see Lenora again until April, and even then, only through the window of a passing car on Drexel. She was moving mulch in a wheelbarrow along the side path we had paved in November, the one Theo Webb named the Pancake Trail, after the morning at Lou Mitchell's. She did not look up. I did not slow down. Nora Ellison, age 44, the Webb Center's first full-time program director, a former Chicago Public Schools literacy coordinator who left after 11 years because she said the paperwork had started to outweigh the children began in May. She had the habit of arriving 20 minutes before anyone else and leaving the back door propped open with a hardback dictionary. I asked her once why the dictionary specifically. She said, because words should hold the door. I did not tell her I wrote that down. Dorian Voss received 9 years federal on a Tuesday in February. The sentence landed in my phone like any other notification between a weather alert and a meeting reminder, and I treated it accordingly. Aubrey received 18 months. Lenora received probation and community service, which I had anticipated from the moment she made that 40-second phone call to Dorian. I set the phone face down on the kitchen table and made coffee. Consequence had simply completed its arithmetic on its own schedule the way it always does when the foundation is correctly laid. By June, the East classroom had its first enrollment, 14 children, ages 6 through 11. Marcus led the orientation himself, standing at the whiteboard in a blue Oxford, and a tie Lily had picked out green with small white dots, and he spoke for 40 minutes without notes. I stood in the hallway outside the door's small rectangular window and watched the back of his head. That is the image I have kept. Not the courtroom, not the envelope. The back of a man's head while he speaks without notes to 14 children who have not yet been failed by anything. In March, Philip Ashford forwarded me Caden's technical rejection of the Voss Property Group Skyline, bid 3 structural miscalculations timeline, non-compliant with municipal code. Cost variance 23% below verified estimate. I want you to understand what it means that Caden's rejection letter had no name on it. It means he finally understood that power does not need a signature to be legible. The letter said what it needed to say, and the absence of Caden's name at the bottom was the most precise thing in the document. I read it twice. I did not call him. He did not need me to. I spent 44 years hiding what I had built so that no one could take it. My son spent 6 months finding the woman who would make him stop hiding what he was. I am not sure which of us worked harder for it. In June, I wore my good jacket for the 2nd time since the courthouse. My Bronzeville backyard holds 40 people if they are willing to share the folding chairs, which they were. Marcus and the children were at the front table. Lily was the flower girl. She took the responsibility with characteristic seriousness, distributing petals with the precision of someone who intends to do it correctly. Theo lost the ring for 11 seconds. Marcus found it under a folding chair. The ceremony did not pause. Some things, it turns out, resolve themselves. I watched my son stand in my backyard and choose correctly this time. In the place he grew up with, 40 people who had been told nothing except to come at 4 o'clock. Caden and Simone faced each other with the full attention of people who have already had the structural disagreements and found the load-bearing walls and decided to build anyway. I raised my coffee cup when the first star appeared over the south side rooftops at 8:43 p.m. Lily walked the aisle with her basket and her precise petal distribution, and when she reached my chair, she paused. She pressed a folded piece of paper into my hand without breaking stride. I slid it into my pocket beside the first one without reading it. Some things you save for later. By late summer, the East classroom enrollment had grown to 31. November came cold, and the center prepared for its December opening. In my kitchen one morning, Caden and Simone arrived with news. They had called ahead, which they do not always do, and I had set out 3 cups without being asked. They sat down. Simone had a particular quality of stillness that I had noticed before. She holds things before she gives them. She said they had chosen a name. I gripped the cup. The ceramic was warm, the kind of warmth that does not announce itself. Caden said Emma Lily Greer. I did not ask about the middle name. I understood what it meant that he had known about the notes, or at least the first one, the 5 green crayon words, and had carried that knowing without telling me, the way I had carried certain things without telling him. We had been doing this for longer than either of us had named it, passing the weight without signing the paperwork. I poured the coffee. I did not say anything. Outside on South Calumet Avenue, a city bus went past. The sound of it reached the kitchen a half second after it appeared in the window, the familiar delay of distance the world, arriving slightly late. I watched the pale rectangle of light on the counter. It had moved another half-inch south. I did not say anything. That was enough. I arrived early at the Webb Center opening because I wanted to see what it looked like before anyone was watching. A building I used to own, a family whose name is now on it. I stood in the parking lot and read both notes in the gray December light before I put them back in my pocket and went inside. The first note was the one Lily handed me outside the Kimpton Gray Hotel on the night before the trial. 5 words in green crayon, the letters slightly uneven, the way an 8-year-old's letters are when she is writing something she means. It said, "You are the good guy." 5 words on a folded square of notebook paper that I had carried in my breast pocket for 14 months. The second note from the wedding in June had 3 words in the same green crayon, possibly the same crayon, the same hand a few months older. It said, "We see you." I have carried heavier things in this pocket, and none of them mattered as much. The building smelled of fresh paint and new carpet, and something that had not yet accumulated a smell of its own, because nothing had happened here yet. Every ceremony that would ever take place inside these walls was still ahead of it. Then I heard Caden's voice in the east corridor running a sound check, and I went to find a spot at the back of the room. Let me tell you what Caden said from that podium about a janitor named Joe. He said it to 300 people who had never heard of Joe. He said it like it was the whole point. He said the building would not exist without a man named Joe, who taught his father that a building is only worth what happens inside it. He did not say Joe's last name. He did not say Joe was a fiction. He said it the way you say the name of someone who taught you something true before you were old enough to know it was a lesson. 300 people applauded for a janitor named Joe, and I stood at the back of the room in my work jacket and did not correct anyone. The crowd filled in by 10 o'clock. 50 families who had been placed in transitional housing through the center's first intake cycle. 35 trade students in their first semester. Childcare at capacity. These were the first people in this story I had ever stood in front of without a strategy. Every other crowd had been a calculation. This one was the reason the calculation existed. Marcus unveiled the bronze plaque at 11:14. The cloth came off and the crowd pressed forward, and Lily took her father's hand and looked up at the lettering and said, "Your name is on the building, Daddy." Marcus looked at the plaque for a long time. What does it mean when someone names a building after you and you were standing right there? And the truest thing you can do is hold your daughter's hand and say nothing. I watched him from 20 feet away and thought, that is a man who has decided what he is building and has started building it. The plaque read, Webb Family Community Center, built by those who understood that what you build outlasts what you own. There was no donor credit beneath it, no LB Holdings, no Walter Greer. The families photographing it would search for an endowment name and find only the sentence. I had written that sentence myself in February, sitting at my kitchen table at 3 a.m. with a legal pad and a cup of coffee that had gone cold. I had written 11 versions before I wrote the one that said exactly what I meant. I had sent it to the engraver with a note that said, no names below the text. Caden did not know that yet. I crossed the crowd and put my hand on Marcus's back. He turned and we held each other the way two people hold each other when words would be a reduction. I did not say anything. Neither did he. We had already said everything that needed saying, some of it in a courthouse, some of it at a Lou Mitchell's table, and some of it in the 11 seconds Theo spent looking for a ring. A 5-year-old asked me if people would remember a stuffed bear in 100 years. I told him maybe 1,000. I have been asked harder questions by better credentialed people, and none of them have stopped me in a hallway the way Theo Webb did on a Tuesday in December. The toy library was the third door on the left off the main corridor, a room Nora had lined with low shelves at child height, everything reachable without asking. Theo walked in ahead of me, cradling his bear, and he found an open spot on the middle shelf and placed it there. He smoothed the ears down, once then again, a small adjustment that had the quality of a decision rather than a gesture. Then he turned around and asked me the question about 100 years. I considered it at full seriousness the way the question deserved. Maybe 1,000, I told him. Theo nodded once the way his father nods and went to find Marcus. I stood in the toy library after he left. The bear sat on the shelf with its ears smoothed, and the December light came through the east window, and I did not move until I heard Lily's voice in the corridor. She was searching for me, specifically. I could tell by the way she came around the corner, with the drawing already held out in front of her. The way you present something when you have been waiting to present it, and the waiting is finally over. It was a crayon drawing on a single sheet of paper, 3 inches by 4, labeled at the top, in green block letters, The Castle. 3 stick figures at the entrance, families visible as small squares in the windows. At the bottom, in careful handwriting that was neater than the crayon work, an inscription, Thank you for building our castle. Lily, age 8. I have signed documents worth more than some countries' GDP. I have never held a piece of paper that cost me more to fold. I folded it once along the center. Thank you, I am going to keep this. I know. Matter of fact. She went back down the corridor, already moving on to the next thing the way children do when they have completed a transaction they understood completely. I slid the drawing into my breast pocket. It was the same pocket that had carried the encrypted satellite phone on September 2nd, 2024, the same pocket that had held 2 green crayon notes for 14 months. The pocket that had carried the architecture of everything now held a child's drawing of a castle. That was enough. Before I tell you what I said on that rooftop, you need to know about my grandfather. His name was not Joe, it was Walter. I called him Joe in the speech because I did not want to explain what it meant to say his real name in a room full of strangers. He cleaned office buildings for 32 years, the loop mostly the towers that went up in the 60s and 70s. He was in those buildings before the people who owned them arrived and after they left. He knew which partners worked late and which ones left the light on, so the cleaning crew would think they worked late. He had a sentence he delivered to me when I was 12, and I have never found a better one in the 40 years since. I carried it the way Theo carried the bear, with both hands smoothed down ears, careful placement. Caden found me on the rooftop at dusk. I had not told anyone I was going up. He found me anyway the way he has always found me, without being summoned, without needing the explanation first. The lake was going amber and then gray, the December light flattening over the water, the way it does when the year is running out of itself. I told him about my grandfather. I told him the sentence. He told me a man's worth is in whether the people he loves are safer, freer, and more capable of joy because he was in the world. I spent 40 years trying to make that sentence true. Caden turned toward the lake. I think you did. Your turn. What do you do after you have delivered those 2 words to your son on a rooftop, and the first star has come out over Lake Michigan? You go back downstairs. There is still work to do. That has always been the whole answer. The star was small and very clear. The first one, the one that appears before the sky, has committed to darkness, and we both saw it at the same time without pointing at it. We stayed until it was fully visible. Then we went back inside. At the top of the stairwell, I told him the grandfather's real name, Walter. He went quiet. Then his voice came low. That is my middle name, Dad. I know. He studied me, recalibrating everything he thought he already understood. I had named him after a man I spent 40 years trying to become. I had never told him that either. We descended the stairs together. The building below us was full of voices, children in the east corridor, Marcus giving a tour to a donor in the main hall, Nora's laugh carrying from the administrative office. The Webb Family Community Center was 3 hours into its first full day of operation and already sounded like it had been open for years. That is what a building sounds like when it was built for the right reason. I reached the ground floor and walked toward the utility closet. The mop was where I had left it that morning, leaning against the wall beside the industrial sink. I picked it up. Caden watched me from the corridor entrance. "You're really going to mop?" "Tuesday morning tradition," I replied. 44 years. I'm not stopping now. He smiled the small smile of someone who has just understood that some things are not about necessity. He turned and walked back toward the main hall where Simone was waiting. I filled the bucket, tested the water temperature, and began at the east entrance the way I always begin. The building was mine. The work was mine. The choice to do it had always been mine. I still mop the Calumet Avenue lobby on Tuesday mornings, 44 years, same tile, same walls. The light comes through the single east window. At the angle it has always come gray in December, pale in March, direct and honest in July. The mop handle is worn smooth in the same two places, the left hand set lower than the right. A habit I never consciously chose but have repeated 10,000 times. This is where it started, in the gap between what people assumed about a man with a mop and what was actually true. I have never found a better place to think. Here is what I know this morning. 50 families are housed at the Webb Center. 35 trade students enrolled in the first semester program. Child care at capacity since the second week of November. Dorian Voss is in minimum security. I do not think about him on Tuesdays. Aubrey completed 18 months at Logan Correctional. Marcus is at the center 5 days a week. Emma Lily Greer is expected in January. Caden is CEO of LB Holdings, his office 1 floor below mine. He still calls on Sundays, and I always answer. Simone is 7 months along, disagreeing with him about the structural wall in the nursery. I know who is right. I have not said. Some things a person learns only by being given the chance to be wrong about them first, and that education belongs to Caden now. My grandfather cleaned office buildings for 32 years. He gave me one sentence when I was 12 in a lobby, not unlike this one, holding a mop. Not unlike this one, a man's worth is in whether the people he loves are safer, freer, and more capable of joy, because he was in the world. He was not making a speech. He was answering a question I had asked about why he kept cleaning buildings when other men had stopped. He said it the way you say something you have already decided is true. I built $1.2 billion and a family out of that sentence. He never lived to know. That is the part I am still working on. Not the buildings, not the number, but how to be the kind of man who gives one sentence to someone and trusts that it is enough. He knew. I am still learning. The nursery wall's solution is clear to me, yet I am down here mopping tile instead of going upstairs. It means the story is continuing. It means I am still in it, still deciding when to speak and when to let a thing develop. The courthouse was the work. The envelope was the work. The mop is the work. The distinction between them is smaller than most people would suppose. I picked up the mop. There was still one more pass to make. Still learning, still watching. That was the whole point. Looking back at my own family story, I realize I spent 44 years building walls of silence to protect what I loved. I chose to be a ghost in my own buildings, watching from the shadows, because I feared that being known was being vulnerable. Don't be like me. Don't wait for a crisis to let the people you love see who you truly are. I almost lost my son to a calculated family betrayal because I thought my silence was his safety. This family story taught me that legacy isn't about the 372 deeds in my desk. It's about the truth shared across a kitchen table. I believe God gave me 40 years of anonymity so that when I finally spoke, my voice would have the power to stop a family betrayal. In my view, the greatest tragedy isn't losing an empire. It's losing the trust of your own blood. Every family story should be built on character, not just assets. My personal takeaway: Power is empty if you have to hide it from those who carry your name. Don't let a family betrayal be the only thing that forces you to stand tall. Thank you for walking this long road with me to the very end. I'd value your perspective. How would you have handled Dorian's $300,000 ultimatum if you were in my shoes? Please share your thoughts in the comments. If Walter's journey resonated with you, consider subscribing so we can share more of these experiences together. A brief note. While inspired by common social themes, certain elements of this narrative were dramatized for a more impactful storytelling experience. If this style of content isn't for you, feel free to explore other videos that better suit your taste.